Today we're working on making pie crust, so one of the steps we're going to use is cutting in. When we cut in, we want to cut it in, it's just like what it sounds like. We're going to cut one ingredient, usually shortening or butter, into another ingredient like flour. So we can use a pastry blender, which many people have probably had in their house and didn't know what it did. I know I did for a long time. Or we can use two knives. I'm going to show you the pastry blender first. This is what we do to get a flaky texture in the crust. So we just crush it in, squish it in like this. You can rotate the bowl if that makes it easier. And we'll keep going until we get what the recipe describes. Usually the recipe will describe something, it will say coarse oatmeal or peas. In this case we'll go until we get it about the size of small peas. I use this for making pie crusts, different kinds of pastries, sometimes scones, and I even use it for shortbread. So use the pastry blender. We talked about measuring in a different demo, so it's important that you measure the ingredients first. Whenever you're going to be cutting in, you want to have your fat, butter, which you normally keep at room temperature, or shortening. You'd want them in the fridge because it cuts up better that way. If it's not cold enough, then it mushes in and we don't get the flakiness. So we'll keep going until we get the size that we want. So that's with the pastry blender. We'll keep going and then we would add in the other ingredients, some water, sometimes an egg, depending on what we're doing with it. Now to do it with two knives, if you notice before we get started, I've cut the shortening up into small chunks and tossed them so that they're lightly coated with flour. Cutting in works because we're cutting it in and it's getting tiny pockets of air but also of the shortening mixed in with the flour so that when you bake it, that shortening stays in the little clumps inside the baking and that's what gives you the flakiness. When you're cutting in is good for one pie. Every fall my family makes 24 apple pies with apples from my dad's tree, and if you're doing 24 pies with cutting in, your hands and wrists can get sore, but for 1 or 2 pies it's fine. And you keep cutting. Use one of these kind of regular sort of dinner knives. You don't want to use something too sharp. It will probably work, but you can end up cutting yourself, and that's not what we want. You want to press down again and again. You can turn the bowl. I don't find I need to do that if I'm using the two knives method. I used the two knives method for years before I figured out what a pastry blender was. Thank you, YouTube. We'll keep going. I want to make sure all the bits are cut up. Search for the big chunks. And this is how we can get nice flaky pastry for pies, different kinds of pastries, scones, and my granny's Scottish shortbread recipe that we like to use. And that is cutting in.